So joining us for our first session today are Stephen Roy from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau, Robert Tardif, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Subsurface Systems Bureau Administrator, and Randall Aaron, a nationally recognized expert on conservation planning and conservation by design. I have included contact information for all these presenters from this first session in case you have questions you'd like to follow up with them after the session that we don't have time to answer during the session. And I'm now going to turn it over to our first speaker, Steve Roy from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services.
Well, hi, my name is Stephen Roy. I'm the section manager in the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau that oversees the state's water well program, as well as the state's community well siting and permitting program. In addition, in the section is the state's water conservation program and water use program, but today I'm just talking about private wells and public well siting standards. Quick snapshot here of where New Hampshire gets its water.
Hey, Steve,
sure.
I don't think that you took control of the slides.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. There you go.
Here we go. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. So quick snapshot on where New Hampshire gets its water. People always tend to have that question. Effectively, a slight majority of the state's residents gets it from community water systems. And if you look generally at where those water systems get their water, the majority of that comes from surface water supplies. A great example would be the city of Manchester and Massabesic Lake being their primary source. They recently developed a secondary source near the Merrimack, but that's the breakdown of where the state gets its water. The smaller number of residents, 40 to 45%, get their water from wells effectively drilled in their backyard, and a significant percentage of those wells are bedrock water supply wells. A lot of people call them locally artesian wells, and effectively they are wells that are drilled within the surface of rock below a person's property, not so much wells that are installed in shallow soil. Quick snapshot here of the typical terrain in New England overall, and New Hampshire specifically. It's a relatively thin layer of silts and clays and fine sand, cobbles, boulders draped on top of rock. The predominant water supply well being one that's drilled into the rock with the intent to encounter saturated fractures below a person's property and pump water out of them, hopefully in a sustainable manner. On the right side of this slide is, the relative vertical profile of the typical types of wells you encounter here in the state. Really only 3 of them are available or in any way routinely used by private water supply well owners. That is the dug well, a point well, and a bedrock drilled well. Point well is a common feature largely in near shore or lakeside environments, not so much outside of an environment strictly like that. Dug wells tend to be relic sources these days, but they still get installed every now and then in the state. Close up of what most people have in their backyard who are served by private wells in the state. Basically, the casing that sticks above the ground is a very small portion of the entire well. Effectively, that steel casing usually extends 20 to 40 to 50 feet into the subsurface. In some instances, as much as 150 to 180 feet until the surface of rock is encountered. It advances into rock some distance, not a long distance, and then the well just becomes a drilled open hole feature after that. Water tends to flow obviously through a fracture network, hopefully at a rate that the user doesn't exceed, and provide water to the home or structure. The state's construction requirements related to private wells and public wells actually are embedded in the state's New Hampshire Water Well Board construction code. This code book defines not only the well construction standards that apply to installing and drilling the well and equipping it with a pump and fitting it with piping and other materials, it also establishes the authority for the Water Well Board to issue licenses to anybody practicing the business of installing wells or installing pumps in people's homes for potable water supply purposes. In addition, it establishes what the well siting standards are in the state for private wells, not public wells, but private wells. And those standards, some of the siting standards and setbacks are what I'm just going to briefly touch on today. And then it also establishes the requirement that any water well driller in the state that installs a well, after they're finished, must submit to the state a water well completion construction record, identifying where they installed the well, what it's used for, and the typical construction parameters of the specific well they installed. Well, cutting to the chase here, within the water well construction standards are the setback requirements. Effectively, what you see here is the residential well setback requirements broken down by individual setback structural feature that they have to stand off of. The setback table works kind of in concert with the Subsurface Bureau rules that Rob Tardif will talk about later. But highlighted in it on that table in red are the most typical, what I call setback issues that are encountered on most private wells that on occasion cause problems. And those setback issues are related to septic system and septic tank setbacks, property line and road setbacks, and then to a lesser extent, highway right-of-way or surface water setbacks. Particularly surface water setbacks sometimes become issues in lakeside communities. Now, what has been noted over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years is that we've got a relatively substantial increase in the number of setback issues that are encountered due to the fact that lot sizes are becoming smaller. Lots are being developed on property that no one ever really thought was that developable due to steep slopes or the proximity of surface water or the wetness of a particular area. More and more we are encountering the requirements for drillers to follow sort of the setback reduction program within their rules in order to install a well on a property and not necessarily have to meet all the setbacks. And these setbacks can be reduced conditionally on a case-by-case or lot-by-lot basis if the driller takes special methods to construct the well. In a perfect world, and this is an image going back to the 80s, in a perfect world, this is the perfect lot. All setbacks related to the well siting and its 75-foot radius are met for the property lines and roads and septic systems as well as septic tank. However, this animal ends up being a more rare animal these days. Something that's a little bit more akin to the reality is something like this. Here you can see sort of circled in red on the right side of the lot is the well location. The arrow is pointing to the boundary of the 75-foot radius. Clearly, the radius in this case goes on to the neighboring lot to the right and goes over swampy or wet surface water areas to the right. And then, to the south or to the bottom of the page, the road, the radius overlaps the road. And then if you look to the blue, I believe the blue circle, the blue square right here, a rectangle, that's the subsurface, basically the septic tank of the home. So for these non-conforming style of structures within the radius, they are allowed to install the well using special methods of construction. However, the driller with the well construction record is required to submit a setback reduction form. The special methods of construction are demonstrated here, and they kind of dial you back to when you're a sophomore in high school in geometry class. They are effectively the calculation for Pythagorean's theorem in a triangle. Here, if you have If you have a non-conforming structure here up in brown, it's labeled road, property line, or septic tank or EA. If it moves too close or within 75 or 50 feet of the well, then the well casing here has to be extended in order to maintain the straight line lineal distance between the structure and the bottom of the casing at 75 feet. So effectively, the closer that this non-conforming structure moves to the well, the more casing you will need. Now, no one expects anybody to do any math in the field, so we provide, well, before I leave this plot, I just want to point out this reduction allowance is for existing lots only that have an existing lot of record for their creation. They are not the septic system setback reduction allowance is not extended to newly created lots that are proposing or submitting a new subsurface bureau application as part of their lot creation process. They only the reduced setback for septic systems or septic leach fields are available only for existing lots of record. So the water well rules and available to the water well drilling community is a table within their rules that they can just look up the distance that they have to reduce the setback to, run across the table, and pick up the required minimum of casing that they have to install in the well in order to meet the special method of construction criteria. So it's pretty easy for contractors to be able to follow this process. Additionally, at the private well level, the 75-foot radius of the protective radius around the well, it is within the rules allowed for these setbacks to overlap onto neighboring properties. I'm not going to go down that path on this topic too much because Rob Tardif is going to touch on it in his discussion about subsurface bureau requirements. But it is allowed, protective radii are allowed to overlap onto other lots. That overlap is identified in the subsurface bureau application, and it requires a release form where the owner of the well with the overlapping radius onto someone else's property has to basically sign a form saying they acknowledge that they're overlapping their radius onto someone else's property, but they release that entity of any liability and acknowledge that they can't hold any neighbor to restrictions on the neighbor's property. Now, Noah asked me to touch on water quality testing, and I need to just state flat out, within the state of New Hampshire, there is no requirement to sample private water supply well water quality. There have been numerous legislative attempts over the years to establish a private well water quality testing standard that either on new home construction or real estate transfer. Those efforts over the years have not been successful. The department, however, sees this as a substantial public benefit to have private well sampling. We have a staff member dedicated to private well sampling outreach. We have multiple programs that run concurrently to extend offers for private well water quality sampling and try to encourage the private well owners to sample. It's all tethered to the fact that, the public health of this state is tethered to the water that comes out of the water quality that comes out of their wells. And we live in a state with substantial naturally occurring contaminants that do have public health impacts over the long term. But here's our recommended list of water quality standards or water quality sampling program that we recommend to private well owners. Lots of it's focused on naturally occurring contaminants, but we have also added perfluorinated compounds for good reason, and VOCs associated with the ubiquity of those cultural contaminants in groundwater in this state. We also provide a website where someone can log in and enter their data from the lab, that they receive from the lab for their water quality, and not only get a summary of which parameters exceed drinking water standards, but also a detailed breakdown of the type of treatment that will work to reduce that contaminant down to below the drinking water standards. It's received a lot of national recognition, has been taken by the EPA and converted into common code. Many other states have taken those common code and built their own sites that are basically mimics of this site. Is a very successful program. Now moving on to public water wells, community water supply wells in the state. A community water system is a public water system that supplies the same population of 25 or more people year round. You know, we all have examples of those probably near us, cities, towns, villages, precincts. But additionally, you know, small water systems also constitute cooperatives, manufactured home parks, condo complexes and homeowners associations, as well as standard single-family home residences built in an open space or cluster subdivision are commonly small community water systems. The requirements for small community water systems are dictated in the state and federal Safe Drinking Water Act, and the criteria for new source approvals and design of those systems are built into the department's administrative rules for well siting criteria and in water system design. And just a note here, so when I say small community water systems, I mean water systems that are built to serve a population of less than 1,000 people. That's the way it's defined in this state. More than 1,000 people, if they're served by a water system, then it's a large community water system. It meets a different set of design standards. So the radius requirements around a community water supply well, stated briefly, are very different than a private well. The radius requirements are not locked into a max of 75 feet. They are dependent upon the size of the water system. The radius around a water supply well cannot have any cultural development, has to remain in its natural state, cannot have any structures other than what's needed for provision of water supply to the community, and can receive no discharge or drainage from any site feature like a detention or retention pond on the subdivision. Again, that table I'm showing you on the bottom right is the table of radius distances, or the size of the radius relative to the production volume that's required to be developed for the subdivision. And the example I'm providing you on the lower left is a typical calculation of what is required to be developed for a water system based on the number of units and the number of bedrooms. The example I'm giving you is a 15-unit subdivision where each unit has 3 bedrooms. The criteria to develop water supply is that 150 gallons per day has to be developed and tested for each bedroom in the subdivision. And in this instance, that equates to about 6,750 gallons per day. And then that design criteria has to be multiplied by 2. And that highlighted in red value, the 13,500, is what a subdivision developer has to test for the production volume for their well. Here's a quick example from Kingston, actually a submittal from last year. This is a 22-unit subdivision with 2-bedroom units, 44 bedrooms total. And effectively highlighted in yellow there is what the facility or the project needs to develop. That's 13,200 gallons per day. That's equivalent to about 9 gallons a minute. And then when you look up the value, the equivalent value on the radius, the protective radius around the well, it's 175 feet, shown in the blue circle below. A very common practice in an open space or cluster subdivision is to site the well within the open space. It's a very good joint use of that space. And as shown here, that circle is bounded by the property lines, does not go over it. There's no development within it. And it is dedicated to providing that area just for the water supply well. The system, the community water system owner has to own or the well site or control the well site in the radius via perpetual easement that is demonstrated at the time of the application for a new water system. Here's another recent example, actually quite recent, from the town of Pelham, 42 4-bedroom units. Once you run through the calculation, this one has to develop 50,400 gallons a day. That's equivalent to about 38 gallons per minute for this subdivision highlighted in yellow. Again, it's installed in the open space portion of the subdivision. Because of the size of this subdivision, the project has to develop 2 wells, both with 200-foot radii. This is a zoom in on that particular property, showing you that the radii of the well are contained within the property boundaries. And in this particular instance, the drainage element I mentioned earlier, there is a site drainage feature constructed on this northern section behind these homes. And you can see that it could have been very easily, a detention pond could have been very easily developed with an outflow heading towards the well, but that's a violation of the well siting standards. So it was run to this low area with this level spreader and a detention pond down here with an outlet outside of the radius of the wells. Again, this particular project points out that the joint use of the open space in the community well is a very supportive joint use. Lastly, the community well water quality standards are substantially different from the private well world in that there is extensive water quality sampling requirements for new community wells. At the time of the pumping test and approval of the well, of a community water supply well, there's a long list of parameters here shown in yellow on the right that have to be sampled for. That sampling program identifies for the water supply development project which parameters exceed drinking water standards and which do not. And then for those that exceed, it also defines the water system treatment requirements that have to be designed as part of the water system design. When the water system goes active, the box on the left kind of describes that there's a lot of scheduled and routine water quality sampling that occurs at the water system starting in the first year and then proceeds on during the whole life of the community water system. And many parameters are sampled on a substantial schedule that ranges from weekly to monthly to annually to 3 or 6 or 9 year intervals depending upon the parameter. So that's all I have here today. I guess we're having some questions here after the end of the session. I'll turn everything over to Rob Tardif of the Subsurface Bureau. Take it away, Rob.
And Rob, just before you get started, we do have one question in the chat now from Glenn Koppelman for you, Steve, asking, would a water system for an assisted living facility fall into the category of community water supply?
Absolutely, dependent. If they serve more than 25 people, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Rob Tardif. I'm the administrator of the Subsurface Systems Bureau within the Department of Environmental Services. What I'm going to do is briefly talk about our lot sizing criteria. I wasn't really intending on getting too far into the septic system design criteria, but if there are questions, I can certainly do my best to answer those questions as well. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Bureau and how we came to be. As you may be able to see, if it's clear enough, we have the administrative position again, which is where I am, and then there's basically 4 fundamental groups to the process here. And one is the plan review section of the plan review group. The second being the construction inspection group. We have a very small enforcement group, and then we have administrative or support staff to initially receive applications and give them essentially a administrative completeness review, and then that also includes staff that basically are receptionists or the frontline folks who answer the phones. What we do, we review and hopefully approve all applications for septic systems and subdivisions in the state. And that's regardless of the size of the system or subdivision, whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, we review and approve all. And being a relatively rural state, the Bureau is responsible for approximately 2/3 of all development that happens within the state. As you can see in the next bullet here, we do approximately 7,500 applications per year, combination of both subdivision and septic. That's down from the, I would say the late 80s, early 90s. We were doing about 12,000 per year. When the recession hit in 2009, we were down to about 3,000 per year. So ever since 2009, we've been kind of climbing back up the ladder here. In fact, we used to provide our numbers to the governor's office as kind of an economic barometer. I'm not sure the commissioner's office has given those numbers to the governor's office recently, but they were used. Okay, so again, when we do septic applications, I like to kind of compare our process, or the analogy I use is when you build a home. And that is, before you build the home, you get a building permit. You build the home, before you can move in, you get a certificate of occupancy. We're very similar to that. So before you can build a septic system, you have to get a design approval, or before you sell subdivision lots, you have to get a subdivision approval. Back to my housing analogy, on the septic system side, you get the design approved, you hire somebody to build the system, you build the system, and before you can put it into operation, the construction side of our program goes out and inspects every system. And then hopefully initially we can issue what's called an approval for operation. Again, back to my analogy, that would be the certificate of occupancy. On both sides of the process, we have what's called a request for more information, or on the construction side, there may be a do not backfill. Either one of those would indicate some sort of deficiency with either the application or the construction. There's an opportunity to correct those, and then the appropriate or the applicable approvals would be issued. Another thing we do is we permit all designers and installers in the state. In order to be allowed to submit a design, you would have to be a permitted designer, and that's also part of the subdivision application. In order to construct a system, you have to be a permitted or licensed septic system installer. Currently, there are some provisions that I don't need to muddy the waters in. There are currently provisions in statute to allow for homeowners to design and install systems for their domicile. Domicile being the place in which they currently live. We also, again, as I showed on the organizational chart, we have our complaint or compliance enforcement group. And then the last thing here is we also, by rule, our permits are the last permits issued. So for instance, if you're doing some sort of commercial development that needs an approval from Steve's group, before we would issue our approvals, the applicant would have to demonstrate to us that by copy of an approval, that all the other applicable approvals have been obtained, and then we can issue our rules. Our approval. So just a real brief history of how we came to be. Back in 1965, there was what was called the island rule, and that was if you were proposing to dispose of wastewater on an island, you had to have an approved system. Back then, it was the Water Supply and Pollution Control Division that would effectively approve these requests. In 1967, the legislature said, "Hey, wait a minute! If we're doing islands, we should do mainland systems, properties." So it was dictated that anything within 1,000 feet of surface water would need an approval. Again, at that point, it was still Water Supply and Pollution Control Division. A little bit later, I guess the decision was made that, hey, if we're going to do it within 1,000 feet, let's just do it everywhere. So the language in 149E removed the term near shorelines, which was defined as 1,000 feet, which effectively made the requirement that any system, any property disposing of wastewater would need an approval from the state. Again, still pollution, water pollution commission. God, I just lost it. But in any event, and then in 1989, the Department of Environmental Services was created in 45A, which is our current statutes, was codified. So again, brief history on how we came to be. So again, I'm going to focus more on subdivision requirements. So in 45A2, there's in Roman 13, there's a definition of subdivision, and it's a very long definition. So I wanted to just kind of break it up to the important parts. So it's when you subdivide a piece into 2 or more lots. Again, immediate, future, sale, rent, lease, building development, you're going to need a subdivision approval. There are allowances in the definition for simple lot line adjustments that would not require subdivision approval. The definition does include condominium conveyance. For instance, if there is a cabin resort, individually owned cabin resort out there, and the property owner wants to sell, and the potential buyer wants to condominiumize those individual cabins, that would take a subdivision approval. Those scenarios are most of the time very difficult to obtain subdivision approval because of lot loading, which I'll get into here in a second. But in any event, any condo conversion requires subdivision approval. Then the last bullet here talks about if you have 2 smaller lots and you want to combine them to make a bigger lot, that would not require a subdivision approval. Again, there's a very long definition in 45A2, Roman 13, that kind of covers all that. Sometimes it can be the lot line adjustment provisions can be confusing. If there are any questions on those, you're better off asking the question to the Bureau. As in general, we have what's called a reviewer of the day. It's a dedicated individual within the Bureau that would field daily questions. I'd be happy to help when I can, but the reviewer of the day may be more available on a daily basis. So this is kind of the crux of what we do. I'm sure a lot of you folks in municipalities and regional planning commissions, or I guess especially municipalities and towns, you may have a minimum lot size. A lot of times these minimum lot sizes are to control, could be used to control development. We at the state don't have any just standard minimum lot size. Everything we do is based on very site-specific soil and lot characteristics of the property. The other thing here in the very first bullet to remember is that we only require subdivision approval for lots of less than 5 acres and those lots that are not served by public sewer. And the whole basis for what we do is to determine that a lot can support a sewage load. If the sewage is being conveyed off the property by public sewer, then it's not, the lot does not have to manage that sewage load, and therefore the Subsurface Systems Bureau does not get involved, and state subdivision approval requirements don't apply. That's not to say that local subdivision approvals don't apply. I would imagine that all towns have their own approval process. So again, lot size is determined. Individual lot characteristics. Soils, are there wetlands? Are there steep slopes? Steep slopes are considered anything over 35%. There's a ledge, and we always take into account the water supply. So what you normally do is you get your proposed lot, and you have to subtract certain characteristics from the lot that are considered unusable. And again, those are, you have to subtract any very poorly drained soils, any slopes over 35%, any ledge, any protective well radii. All of that has to be subtracted from what's considered usable land. What I want to do here, and I'll get back into that process, but what I'm doing here is trying to show what a typical, relatively small subdivision application plan would look like. And you can see that, if you can see it, and I'll zoom in here in a second, but what it was here, you have your parent lot, and the lot is subdivided into 1, 2, 3, and 4 lots. The initial parent lot had a home on it, right? So they're basically keeping their home and cutting off 3 separate lots, I'm assuming for sale. So the application has to show that the well radius has to be maintained wholly on lot. And again, this is what's considered subdivision level. It's septic system level when you're actually applying for the approval for a septic system. All these things can move. And again, I can get into that a little bit later if you like, but I'm trying to focus on just subdivision requirements. So in a sub application, again, you got meets and bounds for the proposed lot. You show that the well radius can be wholly maintained on lot. And this box here is called a 4K area, which is a 4,000 square foot area that is deemed to be suitable for the location of a septic system. And you can see that 4K area cannot be within the well radius. That 4K area also has to be maintained on lot. And there are certain setbacks. You can see in this particular example, there are local setbacks that the designer has used to comply with certain setbacks. The setback we would be more concerned with is the actual lot line. But again, most designers will do their best, and there's more times than not a local review process for subdivision applications before we see them anyway. The other criteria would be at sub level, we require 5-foot contours. Septic level, we require 2-foot contours, but at sub level, it's more of a broad brushed plan. So again, each lot shows 4K outside the well radius. And this next slide is just zooming in on that same application, so you can see it just a little bit better. And meets and bounds, 4K well radii, and in this case, it doesn't appear that there are any wetlands shown. So at subdivision level, what has to be demonstrated in the application is each lot that's being developed or proposed can support a minimum of 600 gallons per day. Now, and residential applications, that's a 4-bedroom home. Now, obviously, if it's not a residential or commercial application, it may be something different. There's a table in our rules, design flows, for different specific types of commercial operations. But at a minimum, it's got to support a 600 gallons per day. To just keep in mind, a perfect 1-acre lot, well-drained soils, flat, no wetlands, nothing to subtract, can support 2,000, by rule, can support 2,000 gallons per day. So it's not very difficult to have a relatively small piece of property meet our subdivision requirements. Again, that gets back to my initial point that everything we do is soil based, lot characteristic based. It's not just a general. For instance, when I moved into the town I live in, minimum lot sizes were 5 acres. I don't think there was any technical reason for 5 acres except for to maybe limit development. For instance, the lot that I live on now is 5.01 acres in size, just enough to meet the town's minimum lot size requirement. So when you go to demonstrate what a lot can support, there is a formula in our rule. And again, as I was talking about before, you take your proposed lot, you subtract out all the land that would be considered not usable land, again, well radii, ledge, wetlands, steep slopes. And then what you do is you come to this formula here, and the flow that you need, which is Q in gallons per day, you divide that by 2,000, which is that perfect lot. And then you multiply that by a sewage loading factor. And in this table, which again, in our rules, you see soil groups across the horizontal and slopes on the vertical. So you determine through test pitting what your soil group is. And then again, with your just analyzing the lot, what the slopes are and not all slopes are homogeneous, so there may be some averaging and whatnot. But in this formula here, you take the sewage loading factor off this table, depending on, again, the lot characteristics, and you determine how much land you need, right? So now this formula says, all right, I need a half an acre. And your analysis of the lot after you subtract all the unusable land says, I have 3/4 of an acre. So therefore, your lot loading criteria is met and the lot can be approved. So the lot loading formula is used on each individual lot in a subdivision application, again, to document that the lot can meet the state requirements. The other thing in this table here, you can see that calculation has been made for folks already, depending on the soil group and the slopes. Those numbers can be a little confusing because people don't realize that includes the well radius, or does that not include the road? So we get all these questions. So we are considering removing those pre-calculated areas from rule and just using the formula to try to eliminate those questions. But that's for a future conversation. So again, on a perfect lot, group 1 soils, minimum slopes by that table, the minimum lot size would be 30,000 square feet. If you have a property with on-site wastewater, but you have an off-site well, again, you're not needing to subtract that well radius, so the minimum lot size is decreased. And then if in those scenarios where you have off-lot wastewater and off-lot well, we wouldn't necessarily get involved, but again, the minimum lot size would be dictated by town ordinance or municipal ordinance. So now we can get into, all of that was more of a standard subdivision scenario. Now we can get into conservation, cluster, open space. There's a number of different names for these types of development. In these scenarios, you can reduce these lot sizes. The bottom line is the amount of land is still going to be pretty much the same as it would be on a standard, and that's my own term here. That's not a term and rule, but more of a standard subdivision. So what it takes in a cluster subdivision is a open space lot. And between all the property and the smaller individual lots and that open space, the calculation is still made to determine that the previous parent lot that's being divided up can still support the sewage load as calculated by that previous formula. So the bottom line is, while you can group the houses closer together, the minimum land required to do that type of development doesn't change much from larger individual lots. Again, this bullet here is hopefully summarizing what I was just trying to say. Now, in these cluster subdivisions, the individual well radii, if you have individual wells for each smaller lot, and I'll have a example of a plan here in just a minute. Those well radii don't have to be maintained on lot at sub level again, but there will be easements required, relative to some cross easements required for those wells. Now you could have, as Steve pointed out in his example, just one community water system out in the conservation land. Again, there's going to be legal documents required to verify that each of those lots have in fact a water supply, but without individual wells in cross well radii, you wouldn't need each individual well to have easements. Hopefully that makes sense. The last thing I wanted to mention here, that conservation area that we're talking about, the easement for that has to be maintained by a third party. Most of the time, it's either the municipality, some local land conservation commission, 501c3 nonprofit type organization. The point there is that the easement can't be maintained by an adjacent, just an adjacent property owner who could sometime in the future change their mind as to what they wanted on their property and disallow that easement or whatever the legal terminology would be. So again, the easement itself has to be maintained by a third party. So this is kind of a just an example of what we could see. I don't know how well you can see, but each one of these lots is about a half an acre. And then you can see this lot here comes around would be that conservation land, and that's about 4 or 5 acres. So if I go to the next slide, this is more of the development. In this scenario, again, there are many different scenarios for cluster subdivisions. In this case, you have individual wells, overlapping well radii, and you also have, here's that 4K area I was talking about. So in this scenario, it was proposed that each lot still has an individual sewage disposal system, an individual septic system. That doesn't necessarily have to be. You could, put sewer pipes in the ground and have that individual sewage disposal system somewhere out here on the conservation land. Different scenarios for different lot characteristics or different needs or wants by the developer or the potential buyers. There are pros and cons to everything if you think about it. Me personally, I would prefer to have my own septic system. That way I'm not depending on all my neighbors not to do certain things that could prematurely fail the septic system. Grease, paint, coffee grounds, all kinds of stuff that people may not think about that they shouldn't be dumping down into their septic systems. If I have control of my own, it's up to me as to how that system is treated. It's the same sort of thing with wells. Do I want to? And again, this is a personal preference. Do I want to have the same water supply and have to, pay water supply bills and things like that? Where if I have my own individual well, I'm going to be responsible for that well. But again, I'm responsible for that well. I don't share that responsibility with others. So there are, again, a number of different scenarios that can be used in these developments. Condos are very similar to cluster subdivisions. I mean, again, the bottom line is the parent lot on the condos has to support the sewage load based on the soil characteristics. And this is an example of just a duplex, a condominium duplex. You can see the parent lot, again, is required to support the sewage load of these two-bedroom condos. You show this limited common area. It's still all common, but this limited common area kind of dictates somewhat of personal ownership, not quite personal ownership, but effectively personal ownership of an area of the lot. But again, the bottom line, the takeaway here is the lot has to support the entire sewage load. Again, very similar to manufactured housing. It's got to support the sewage load based on soil characteristics. And I just wanted to end with a quick note on innovative technologies. Innovative technologies, those technologies are approved by a committee here within the department. The rules governing those innovative technologies are within the Subsurface Systems Bureau rules, but the committee is made up of people from Steve's group, people from wastewater engineering, people from the legal unit, staff from the Subsurface Systems Bureau. And these applications are submitted and they document that they meet certain criteria, and then they get approved for use. The point I want to make on those is what these innovative approvals do is allow for reductions or waivers to septic system sizing and setbacks. The setbacks typically are setbacks to seasonal high water table, not necessarily setbacks to property lines. The real takeaway on that is that they don't allow for a reduction in lot loading. The thought there is if the innovative technology system fails, we can at least be comfortable with the fact that the lot still supports the entire sewage load. So that's a little bit of a misconception out there that if I put in an XYZ advanced treatment technologies, I can put more wastewater on a lot. That's in fact not true. You can just, the intent or the thought is the treatment technology treats the waste so it doesn't take quite as large of a septic system to then treat the waste. In any event, I just wanted to take a quick note, and I think I'm just about out of time. So I can turn it over to Randall. Again, Noah, if there are any questions, I didn't notice if there were questions. I could
Yeah,
try
so
to quickly.
great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Yeah, we did get a couple questions in the chat during your presentation. Actually, our first question I think was actually for Steve from Todd Horner. What about wells that serve more than one but fewer than 15 connections? What regulations apply? Oh, didn't want to do that.
Sorry about that. So fewer than 25, but
Fewer than 15, but more than one.
All right. So those are not regulated public water systems per the definition in both state and federal statute. And we do have built into the statute at the state level what's called the state monitored system for water systems that are built and designed, built and partially built and approved, designed, approved, and partially built with the intent to be greater than 25 people, but have not got there yet. Let's say they have only 9 homes built so far out of 49 homes. We'll bring them into the program as what's called a state monitored system until such time that they get above 25 people, and then that triggers public water system. But if a system is strictly and only kept to below 25, it is not a regulated public water system by the state of New Hampshire underneath the Safe Drinking Water Act. Most instances, that's a subdivision with less than 10 homes, because the Census Bureau establishes 2.5 people per home. So 10 service connections per the Census Bureau means 25 people are served. 15 service connections, we wouldn't wait until the 15 to regulate it. We'd regulate it at 10, and it's all the onus would be on the project owner to demonstrate that their particular site, even at 10 homes, doesn't necessarily serve more than 25 people. And they'd have to submit an affidavit to that and demonstrate home by home how many people are there. But that's where we are.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And we have a question from Stephanie H. Does RSA 485-A:29 apply to lots larger than 5 acres for subdivision for 16 houses? I think that's for you, Rob.
That's a darn good question. And I would have to say, again, the statute clearly states that subdivision approval is not required for properties over 5 acres. I'll be honest, I will look into that question. I mean, of course, the septic, once you get into, again, I was saying septic level, sub level, once you get into septic level, you're going to have to demonstrate that 5 acre lot can support the sewage load for 16 houses, and it may not. But for subdivision approval, I think we'd get into, that sounds like it would be more of a condominium type of scenario. And at condominium, there is requirement for subdivision approval for, it says condominium conveyance. I want to make sure I'm giving you the right answer. So if I could, I would like to research that and get back to you if I could.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we have another
Apologize
question.
for not knowing the answer to that right off.
We have another question from, that's okay. We have another question from Todd Horner. So even if each lot is intended for a 2-bedroom home, an applicant still needs to meet the 600 gallons per day minimum?
That's correct.
Okay, great. And then finally, a comment / question from Andrew Sanborn. I'm assuming that all the calculations and conditions are reviewed by New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and not the local planning board, everything you went through, Rob.
Everything to get a state subdivision approval is reviewed by the Subsurface Systems Bureau. Again, more times than not, there are prior approval requirements at the municipal level. But that is, in my non-lawyer opinion, would have to be through some sort of local ordinance.
Right.
But all the calculations that we require are reviewed and approved by the Subsurface Systems Bureau.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. All right, we are now going to turn it over to Randall Arendt. Randall, you should be able to take control of the slides. Great. Okie dokie, we don't. Okay. Do you mind turning on your camera, Randall, or do you prefer to keep it off?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great, wonderful. Well, thanks for inviting me to present on conservation subdivision design. Very quickly, it's a very much greener version of clustering. It's why it was basically invented about 25 years ago, because many cluster ordinances did not live up to their potential. Conservation subdivision design typically preserves 50% of the buildable land in addition to wetlands, floodplains, and steep slopes. Could be a higher percentage if your base density is 1 unit per 3 acres or 1 unit is 4 acres. Conservation subdivision design really requires a conceptual sketch plan, and that's based on experience. A preliminary plan involves so much money that developers will not want to backtrack. So you begin with a conceptual sketch plan and a site walk with planning board members and maybe even abutters at that very early stage where things are flexible and a lot of engineering has not yet been done. So those are two very important parameters. Rural by Design is the latest book that I've written. You can buy it at Amazon. You could buy it from me at my website. Just Google my name and the website will come up. The two books specifically on conservation subdivisions are this one and that one, published by Island Press. Sorry. Growing Greener and Conservation Design for Subdivisions. This way I've written my ordinances, it's a density neutral approach. And the lot count is determined either by a yield plan, which is realistic, doesn't include make-believe lots that would normally be unbuildable, or by a formula that's based on net buildable land. Build-out scenarios and open space networks are part of what communities often go through before adopting such an ordinance. And they would map out their community in terms of primary conservation areas, which are wet, flood-prone, steep, unbuildable. And secondary conservation areas, which are everything else, buildable farmland, buildable woods. And we get an idea for what would normally be preserved anyway, primary conservation areas, wet, flood prone, or steep, and 50% of the buildable land. So in this map here, the unbuildable land, primary conservation areas are black. And you can't see it very well necessarily, but there's yellow, which is farmland, and green, which is woodland that are buildable. focusing in on a map like that, we can see the conservation lands pre-mapped by the community, which helps developers so they don't flounder around quite as much in terms of, well, where should I put the conservation land? In the woods, on the farmland, where? And this community basically mapped out its woodlands and the stream valleys that lead down into the rivers. It said, develop our farmland, preserve the little bit of woods we have. This is from York County, Pennsylvania, where woodlands are pretty rare. So in New Hampshire, the opposite would probably be true. You might want to save your farmland, number one, and build in the woods, which are abundant. This shows the green land in Westwood, Massachusetts that were preserved the old-fashioned way by buying it with public dollars or appealing to landowners to donate easements. All the light green land is land that came through the subdivision design process westward, which is almost on the New Hampshire border up near Lowell, adopted conservation subdivision design 2 decades ago. Excellent experience with it. Choosing which site features to protect and which to build upon is pretty much your number one decision. If you want to save the woodland, you put the homes in the farmland. And if you want to save the farmland, you basically put the homes in the woodland. If the lots are too small for both an individual well and an individual septic, a community well could be in the open space, or a community septic system could be in the open space. And there are variations on that too, because there could, for 20 homes, you might have 7 smaller shared systems instead of one large system for all 20 homes. Sites visits are absolutely essential to discover and evaluate the site features. Planning board members, no matter how good they are, can't really tell what a property is really like by looking at a piece of paper. It doesn't work. So this should be mandatory for all planning board members. If you're afraid of snakes, you're afraid of spiders, you're afraid of ticks, fine. Let's appoint you to the library committee or the finance committee or the school board. You don't belong in the planning board if you're not going to be able to go out with boots on the ground. Now, if you're temporarily sick, you've got a broken leg, you're excused. You're away on vacation, you're excused. But generally speaking, a planning board member has got an obligation to walk the property. Otherwise, they really can't make an honest evaluation of where to put the homes and where to put the open space. Here's the entire planning board and conservation commission of Willington, Connecticut, out on a frosty morning in March. 4-step design process, something I kind of invented about 25 years ago, consists of identifying the conservation areas first. And that's the most important step. You don't proceed with anything else before you've outlined the green areas. Then you locate the house sites for adding value and adding livability. Then you connect the homes with streets. Don't ever put in a street system first. That's what engineers do. Then you draw on the lot lines. And who designs the conservation subdivision sketch plan? In my view, the way I write my ordinances, it is not the engineer. It is the landscape architect or a physical planner. They should be doing the planning. They should be doing the designing. And as soon as you finish steps 1 and 2, conservation areas and house sites, then the engineers come in with their expertise to design the street system and the stormwater drainage and the details on wells and septic systems. No, that doesn't mean engineers are not part of the conservation conversation from the beginning. They are. They're a member of the team from the get-go, but they're not the designers for steps 1 and 2. They're the designers for steps 3 and 4. And that's pretty important because engineers do not have the skill set to really design a conservation subdivision unless they have a very close working relationship with landscape architects in their own office and have absorbed a lot of the landscape architecture design principles. So here's a piece of land before development. And this is your conventional yield plan with 1 acre lots in the 1 acre zone, 2 acre lots in the 2 acre zone, 3 acre lots in the 3 acre zone. And there's really no open space. Everything is a house lot or a street, but it tells you the lot yield. And I would normally do perk tests on all of those, on 10% of those lots, which are the most dubious. This lot here is highly dubious with all the green area that is not good for septics. Some of these lots down in here could be dubious. Lots in here are should be very, very good for septics. But I'd like to have a 10% sample where the town or the town engineer chooses the 10% of the lots, 3 out of 30, that raises eyebrows. And if those pass, then I suggest that is a good number to begin with for your yield plan, your total lot count. Now that doesn't mean that you don't get really serious about the septic later on. You do, but are we talking about a 30 lot subdivision, a 35 lot subdivision, a 25 lot subdivision? Developer might come in with an airy fairy make-believe plan, and you got to inject some realism in it. No sense designing 35 lots in a conservation design only to find out that he's only got soil for 30 or 28. So step 1, primary conservation areas is step 1A, shallow soils, wet soils, floodplains. Then that's what that kind of looks like. And then step 1B, which is secondary conservation areas that are buildable, like the farmland in green, the woodlands in dark green, the historic farmsteads here that you want to preserve, the stone wall that you want to preserve, the view shed in from the public road that you want to preserve. All the things you want to preserve are shown in step 1B. And that is a typical view of upland, which is buildable, but you want to maybe design around the stone walls and use them at the edges of roads or the edges of house lots. Let's get creative. So at the end of step 1, you end up with the green areas to preserve and the yellow areas, which is fine to build on. And you want to, and not the highest priority for preservation. So step 2 is to populate the buildable areas with the houses that meet the yield plan number. Then this is where the engineers come in big time with streets and trails and roads and septic system locations, etc. And then drawing in the lot lines, which is the least important part of the whole thing. Legally, you don't even need them. You could be totally condominium. But most people like lot lines, I do, and I put that into step 4. So this is what you would normally get without conservation design, and this is what you would typically get with conservation design. So plant your conventional versus your conservation design, your conventional versus the conservation design. And I've got these slides I can give you if you want to do a presentation in your own community. I do presentations, used to doing them with carousel slide projectors years ago. Then we often do hands-on design exercises after the slideshow, so people move little M&Ms around and create, put the houses in the areas that are not green lined as conservation areas. It's really a very helpful learning exercise for planning board members that typically follows one of my presentations. Here's a typical 10 lot property in Maine where the developer came in with this plan and the planner said, well, it has to be conservation design now, and let's begin by locating your primary conservation areas, which are kind of wet or flood prone or have some slope to them. And then the secondary conservation areas are basically the rest. And developer says, well, where do I put my homes? And the planner says, well, you put your homes on part of that secondary conservation area, like that. How's that? And the developer says, well, I like that because it's a much shorter, cheaper street system. Everyone's got a beautiful, uninterrupted view of permanently preserved open space. And the septic systems, if need be, can be off lot as individual septic systems in the common open space. Or they could be community systems, maybe a system for 3 units here and a system for 5 or 6 units over there. Many variations. Before the preliminary plan is submitted, you really need to compare 2 sketch plans, which is the yield plan that tells you what the normal configuration and lot count would be, plus this conservation design based upon that lot count. And here are 2 sketches too, your conventional sketch, and then converted into a conservation design. Another example here, this is a sad story. The town came to me after the preliminary plan was submitted with the plan on the left, and they said, can you design something better? I said, I can, but it'll go nowhere because the developer has already spent $65,000 engineering the preliminary plan on the left. So he's not going to turn around. But they use the design on the right as a learning tool and a teaching tool for future developers. So once a developer comes in with a preliminary plan for a conventional, basically it's game over. He's not going to change. As an extension to a village, we could do plan A on the left or plan B on the right, so the village can have some playing fields, so the village can actually have a village green. Sorry about this. And the new village green for the entire village could be right there. So you can really make up for deficiencies in an old village that doesn't have such things. Conservation lands have been used for a lot of different uses: farmland, horse pastures, hay fields, just meadows, trails, tot lots, orchards. And this is a solar farm in an orchard in the Westford, Massachusetts area. Bird boxes, habitat protection, tree farms, lots of different uses for the conservation land. And I mentioned Westboro, Mass earlier on. They, as of almost 10 years ago, they'd preserved about 450 acres of land with conservation subdivision design. Didn't have to pay a penny for it. Other towns in Massachusetts, 650 acres, 875 acres. It's a really good deal, and it doesn't require the developer to give up anything because he gets the same number of lots and can service them at lower cost. Now, one option is on-lot well and on-lot septic. Jarvis Farm in Westford, where the lot sizes ranged, they're about a half an acre. At the time this was built, that met all the codes, and they had really good soils. So they had on-lot well and on-lot septic on those good soils on the half-acre lots. And this turned out to be the first conservation subdivision they ever did. It's beautiful. It's built around a 2-acre green. And the original design, if I have it here, I'm not sure. I don't, but the original design was a conventional. These are the trails that lead off from that subdivision. This is another view of Westford conservation land. Here, the dark green is land they acquired through purchase or donation, and the light green is donated by developers of conservation subdivisions. Now, off-lot septics can either be individual or shared. They have to be located on easements within the common open space. And important to emphasize, this flexible approach allows septics to be located on the deepest and best drained soils on the entire property. So when you do your initial analysis of the property, if you find one part of the property is much better for septic than somewhere else, don't put house lots there if you want to have smaller lots for, say, empty nesters. reserve the best soils for off-lot individual septics or off-lot community septics. So this is a real advantage. Strathmore Farms in Madison, Connecticut, they had basically 10 to 12,000 square foot lots. They were condos on equivalent areas, equivalent lot areas of 10 to 12,000 square feet. So this is what it looks like. And over in here, this is a meadow with really good septic soils, and that's where the septic systems were put. Here are the homes, and here is a wetland leading down to the Hammonasset River. So the view from River Road is a view of protected open space with subsurface septics, individual in this case. And the view from River Road, which is over here, is across the property to this village, which they built on about 10,000 square foot lots. And the individual systems are located out here. An advantage of individual system is you control it. Another advantage is the developer doesn't have to build a community system, takes more money up front, longer approval time. And a benefit for the community, the town, is that if the system breaks, the system needs to be repaired, you don't have 10 units going offline. You've got 1 unit going offline because his system failed, and he has the responsibility to fix that system. It's as simple as that. So you could never get a layout as beautiful as this. This looks like a time capsule. Was that built in 1780 or 1980? And 1980 is the answer, and conservation design was the reason. Typically, you have enough room on a small lot for your septic tank. And the rules for the condo association, home association, should mandate that each one of these people pump their systems every 3 years, or the home association uses its dues to pump everybody's leach field. I mean, everybody's septic tank every 3 years. So the leach field never clogs up, or its life is extended a long time because you've got this periodic pumping of the septic tanks. Off-lot community septic is like where you have a layout like you had in the last picture, but there's a community system instead of 10 or 20 individual systems. The community system is right here. I designed this one in Ipswich, Mass, about 15 years ago. Their central open space is actually a bit of a hill. And this is a nice flat, dry piece of land. And back in here is a mixture of uplands and wetlands. So we didn't want to get back in there with the houses. Yeah, you could put houses back in the upland portions and stretched out the road system, but keep it nice and compact. Keep your conservation area nice and unfragmented. So the homes here are fairly close together. They're fairly upscale, and they all drain to one central drainage field and septic system. This is a rain garden, which I designated in an area by the roadside. I did not design it, but I said, this is how you should handle your stormwater. And we had a great landscape architect with an engineering partner design it. Another way of doing this is to have shared systems that are small or shared systems that are wells. So this example in Guilford, Connecticut, where the lots would be equivalent to 5,000 square feet, have shared septics that serve maybe 3, 4, 5 lots instead of having major community systems. So these are the septics here in community, smaller community systems. I can't remember whether there's public water to this property. I don't see any W's, so I think it's served by public water. So this is what I call the golf course development without the golf course. And the septic systems are located on the best soil on the property, and the homes are located on the ledgier parts of the property. Here's an aerial view. It's an absolutely stunning development. It's been there on the ground for now about 30 years. One of my favorites. So here's a view of looking at a particular house from the open space. And if you went to the behind that wall and look back outward, all you'd see is open space with the house behind you. This is another example of pretty much the same thing, but the homes are actually on individual lots. Shared septics, some have individual off-lot septics, but mostly shared septics. And the W's are the shared wells. So there's a shared well, there's a shared well, there's a shared well, and these are the shared septics here, 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 and there, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. That's a septic field for 3 homes right there, and it's not mowed grass. They mow it once a year to keep it as a wildlife meadow. That's what that same meadow looks like in the fall, and they mow it once a year so it doesn't grow up into shrubs and trees. Now you can have a central system and you can have a central well. And here's an example in Stratham, Chisholm Farm, and that works very well. And this is a picture of what that kind of looks like on the ground. Here's an example that I'm more familiar with in Chester County, PA. And if these were lots, they'd be 5,500 square feet. They're very compact, very close together, very popular with young couples, with toddlers, with empty nesters, with seniors. If you got, 3 kids and 2 dogs, probably not the ideal arrangement for that part of your life. But when you're an empty nester, you might decide to move there. Or before you acquire the 3 kids and 2 dogs, this might be the ideal place. So the septic systems are located up on a ridge up in here, and the community well is down in here. You can see all of these are single family detached, but the developer called them detached townhouses. The market was townhouse, but an upscale townhouse without connecting walls. So he built in a townhouse district, but he didn't want to do townhouses because he could get more money by separating them into detached townhouses. It was a brilliant idea. That ends my portion. I try to keep within my 20 minutes so we can have time for Q&A. And if you are interested in checking out the Rural by Design, go to my website and you'll find on it under products a lot of free stuff. But there are also books to buy. And there are also descriptions of the books, like all the comments from people that have reviewed it, and a complete table of contents. So if you want to delve more deeply into this, that resource down there is where to go. And if you forget it, just Google my name and it'll come up. So thank you for welcome your questions right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Randall. That was very informative. We have one question from Todd Horner. Do you recommend that communities make conservation subdivision mandatory?
If you can, absolutely. If you dial back a couple decades, many communities in New Hampshire mandated sprawl. They did not allow clustering. They did not allow PUDs. They only became on the horizon in the late 1960s. And throughout the 70s and 80s, many towns in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont didn't allow clustering at all. They mandated conservation design. So legally, you can do it. And there are a number of towns in New Hampshire that have mandated it. But if that sounds a bit draconian and town meeting says, no, that's too far. Say, okay, here's an alternative. Let's make conservation design by right permitted use and conventional large lot a special exception or conditional use. And in order to get approval for that special exception or conditional use, you've got to make a convincing case at a public hearing that a conventional design that preserves no open space and everything becomes a house lot is better comports with the official policies of the comprehensive plan. Policies like It is the policy of our town to preserve farmland, wooded wildlife habitat, scenic views, um, wildlife corridors. And it's impossible really to make an argument that dividing everything up into a 2-acre, 3-acre, 4-acre lot better meets the goals and the objectives of the comprehensive plan. So that's a way of essentially getting conservation design to be done by everybody, but it doesn't mandate it. It just shows the planning board that a sprawl design with large lots is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan and therefore must be denied.
Right.
So that's my favorite way of attaining a conservation design goal without specifically mandating it.
Great. That's
Any
very
more
helpful.
questions?
Yep. Yeah, we got another question. We'll take one more question here and then we're gonna have to wrap up. Got one more question here from Todd Horner. Have you seen good examples of conservation subdivision with mixed income housing options?
There are actually not a lot of examples of any kind of subdivision with mixed housing options, sadly to speak. The key is to have all the homes look the same except for size, so that the affordables look like a junior example of the more expensive house. It might not have all the gables, but it'll have the same kind of windows, the same kind of clapboards, the same kind of trim. Uh, uh, but it won't have 3,000 square feet. It might have 1,800 square feet or 1,600. So I think the key to doing that successfully in the marketplace is to make it conform like that. Now, in Rural by Design, there is an example not far from the New Hampshire border in Lincoln, Massachusetts, of something called either Lincoln Meadows or Battle Road Farm. And if you Google Battle Road Farm, it's in Lincoln near the National Battlefield, Revolutionary Battlefield. You may find information on it. Certainly, I can email that to people. The way they have mixed the housing has been to build all the housing as some attached, 2-family, 3-family, 4-family. It's all attached in that manner. But some of the units are bigger than others. And you don't know, looking from the outside, who's got what. They've got 3 housing types: affordable for seniors, affordable for pre-seniors, working age, and then market rate. And the market rate and the affordable, 2 affordable categories work very well together. I might be able to think of more examples, but developers generally do not want to mix price points. And if they do, they want to keep all the low-cost units segregated down some cul-de-sac as if they're, inferior people. They're basically, your kids and mine trying to struggle to find a place in the housing market. Or they might be the rookie fireman or the school teacher that's, not got a huge salary because just qualified 3-4 years ago. So if you email me, go to my, there's my email address. I'm happy to respond after the program.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Randall. That was incredibly informative. I'll also note that Rob Tardif put in the chat, says the quick research seems to indicate creating new condominiums in New Hampshire would be considered a condominium conveyance, which he's correct about, which would also require subdivision approval from the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. And Rob also includes a really helpful article from the New Hampshire Municipal Association, NHMA, written a few years ago about kind of Q&A, legal Q&A about condominiums and land use controls that I suggest folks check out. Here is a couple of other additional links and information on best practices for conservation subdivision design in New Hampshire, as well as other innovative approaches for developing housing in areas with well water and septic. And unfortunately, we are over time, so we did get to a bunch of questions during the session. We're not going to have time for an additional Q&A session, but that's fine. That's kind of how it's gone for a bunch of our other sessions. So again, I want to thank all of our speakers, Steve, Rob, and Randall, for a great session. And thank you to everyone for attending and for all the great questions. And if we didn't get to your questions, the three speakers have offered for you to follow up with them by email. I did include everybody's email addresses included earlier on in the slides. OPD would also be happy to answer any questions, so feel free to contact us as well. And the slides for this session are going to be available for viewing and downloading on our conference webpage, and the link to the recording will be on OPD's YouTube channel by early next week. So we also welcome and encourage any feedback you have on this session. A link to a brief anonymous evaluation form is available on the OPD conference page and will be posted in the chat. Actually, I think my colleague Ken already posted it. I'm going to go ahead and post it, put it here down here, so it's just current in the chat. This evaluation form is just specific for today's conference, the May 7th session. If you attended our conference last Saturday, April 30th, there was a different evaluation form.